Good evening, everyone. This is a meeting of the school committee's policies subcommittee. We have a lengthy agenda today, and also there are a lot of meetings on that some of our subcommittee members need to attend. So I'm going to try to get us through relatively quickly and end a little earlier than we normally would. So our first agenda item is review and approval of the minutes of the December 13th policy review subcommittee meeting. Have members had an opportunity to review them? Okay, would someone like to move them? Thank you, Jennifer. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Thank you, Valerie. Valerie, your vote?
Yes.
Jennifer, your vote?
Yes.
Andy?
Yes.
And I also vote yes. All right, next up on our agenda is a discussion of attendance policy. So at a recent docket review meeting, Dr. Guillory had mentioned that there was some interest in discussing attendance related issues and how they have implications for our policy. So Dr. Guillory, I'll turn it to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. So upon my entry here into Brookline, attendance and attendance policy has been one that folks have brought up. So I think this is just an initial mentioning to the community as well as to the subcommittee that this is something that we'd like to take on and start reviewing. I think it has some added challenges given where we presently are with COVID right now and pandemic, I'll call it pandemic behavior or pandemic attendance right now. But I think in the broader scheme, this is one that we need to think about deeply. And then I'd be curious to hear, I know what you all have heard in terms of past experiences with the attendance policy. And then we can sort of chart a course forward for its review and updating.
All right, thank you. And I also see that we have Megan Guiney on, and I assume that perhaps she would like to be speaking on this from the Office of Enrollment. Robin, if you could promote her to panelist. Thank you, Ms. Guiney. Whenever you're ready, if you'd like to talk about some current issues in attendance that you would like for us to be addressing.
I'm just here as a visitor, actually.
Okay. How about
Curious to hear what you have to say. That's all.
all right, subcommittee members, any thoughts on attendance related issues in response to Dr. Guillory's question to us? Jennifer?
I think that there was a question about some interest in talking about attendance, the attendance policy or attendance issues. So I'm not really sure what particular issues the district is dealing with right now, that or what particular parts of the policy we might want to take a look at. I will say that over the last 4 years, we've talked about the attendance policy a number of times, but to my recollection, it has not been updated, but there has been interest for many years in updating the attendance policy. And it feels like the last few times that we actually had it on the docket, David, and I'm talking not lately this year, but over the last several years, something has happened. And I feel like the last time that it got derailed was because of COVID. But my memory could be wrong, but I feel like we were making some progress on like analyzing it more, looking at it line by line. And then I think COVID hit and we had other attendance issues as in pandemic related issues, remote learning and what were we going to do in hybrid learning. But we had looked at it prior to that several years ago, David. Do you remember? We had started to look at it and there were a number of, it was a very, very long policy. The draft that was given to us was a pretty substantial policy. And so part of it was deciding what was policy and what was procedure. So that was sort of the first level of when we were looking at it originally. So I'm happy to look at it for the policy committee subcommittee to look at it again and review it. And I think it would be helpful to hear what are some of the areas of concern where perhaps our policy doesn't match or the procedures and the policies don't match well, or where the policies could be maybe really outdated and really need to be more aligned. And I'm not sure, as one final thought, where they may deviate from existing Mass General Law that we need to update as well.
Yes, that matches my recollection, Jennifer. And also the most recent times that we had discussed attendance policies were around whether we could mark students as present if they were participating remotely. That was back at a time where remote learning was still a potential option for students through DESE. And we were also grappling with the definition of meaningful participation in academic activities and whether students could be marked as present in that scenario. I don't think we ever got a firm answer on that, and ultimately we did not significantly revise the policy. To me, it would be helpful to hear from staff about what central office feels should be areas of focus as we go through the attendance policy. And also understanding that we're somewhat limited in what we can do with attendance because DESE obviously has guidelines, our statutory regulations around this, and we need to make sure that we're in compliance.
And as far as the work that you've done already, is Jennifer or any of the committee members, was it just left in suspense, or do we have any record of what has happened so that we're not starting from scratch or that type of thing also?
I suspect that there are, I do not believe, David, please correct me if I'm wrong or if your memory is better than mine. I don't think that we actually officially updated the attendance policy, David, through a vote. Actually, Robin could tell us when we last voted it, but I'm sure there are drafts out there of work that was done or proposed edits. David, I don't remember if the very early version that I had seen edits and revisions for were edits and revisions proposed by the district, if I remember correctly, that maybe came from Nicole Gittens, perhaps, or maybe also in collaboration with Mary Ellen at the time, Norman. That was a number of years ago. I would say that was probably 4 years ago. I think it was when I first came on the committee. So those edits and revisions may not even be necessarily relevant to the kinds of work that we need to do now, but they may. Those were not approved. That was a very lengthy document. I think that's what I mean about like really kind of separating out policy and procedure. I remember it being a significant, like, I don't want to exaggerate, David, but I think it was like maybe 20 pages or something. Like,
Oh my.
yeah, no, so it really, we needed some, and we were starting to delve into that work. We were dealing with a lot of policies at once, David, if you remember, like we were constantly going through a rotation of them and having trouble making headway on a number of them, including the attendance policy. So then we came back to it again, and I think COVID hit. And so there probably is another draft that may be on a more simplified version. We could also start, sometimes David will have us start with an MASC policy or a neighboring policy to sort of come and see what we might need to make it into a Brookline policy. I'm sorry, David, that's a lot of talking for me, and I'm not the chair. I'm gonna be quiet.
No, I appreciate that because I think what you're recalling predates my tenure on, you predate my tenure on policy by a year. So I don't have a recollection of this initial draft you're referring to, Nicole Gittens, but I can try to find that. And I do think a good approach to take would be to look at the MASC peer districts, what they have for attendance policies. And that's often a good way to gauge where we are by way of comparison and see if we would like to be more in line with what most other communities and the MASC are recommending. Any other thoughts from subcommittee members? So Dr. Guillory, would you like us to continue this discussion at the next policy meeting for February with perhaps a possible draft that's MASC based?
Well, I think
off of that, or
I think what we need to do is look at it internally here first. Try to see if we can collect some of what has been done previously. Take a look at that, and then you and I can discuss when it needs to come back to the committee for next action. Because again, it's hard right now, so I know some of the things that I've been told about the attendance policy, but again, it's exacerbated in COVID time. And so I don't want to try to commingle the two or have two that are coexisting at the same time also.
Okay. All right, any other thoughts on attendance? Jennifer?
No, I would just add that I do think it's really tricky with COVID absences right now in our policy for, attendance. I do think, Dr. Guillory, that that's really tricky to sort of do that. And I'm not sure how we address that in the language of a document when we hope that the pandemic and all of these absences will, be coming to a closure in the near future. I don't know how we differentiate that or make allowances for that within the language of the policy. And maybe that's a procedure piece. I don't have the answer to that right now, or myself. Yeah, I think, I'd love to hear some more feedback from the district on issues that are really relevant to the district. And so we can look at that lens when we're looking through that lens when we're looking at the policy.
I would as well.
Is attendance one of the subheadings in our COVID policy that where we kind of allow the superintendent to do what he needs to do, basically, in COVID times?
I think it is, but my recollection, Andy, was that that's very much limited by what DESE allows. And so I was actually just going to ask Dr. Guillory whether there had been any discussion among either your peer superintendents or with DESE about whether they would look at COVID absences differently again this school year, or whether they are holding the line on all absences being equal.
We continue to ask that question. We haven't gotten a final determination on it as of yet, but that is something that I started asking in September. And at each opportunity, we bring it up because all are expressing concern about their district-wide attendance rates right now.
All right, thank you. Okay, so I think we should move ahead to the next item. We'll certainly be readdressing attendance again after we solicit more input from staff and have further discussions about the direction that we would like to take. So the next item on our agenda is a possible vote on replacement of headmaster terminology with head of school from all existing policies. So at our last meeting, as you may recall, we took a vote to refer to the full school committee, basically our endorsement of changing the language. This vote is to specifically change the language in each policy where it appears. So I went through our entire policy manual and wrote down every instance where headmaster is mentioned. It's possible I missed one or two, but I think I captured it all. And so that's the long list you see below agenda item number 3. And rather than having over 32 separate votes, I would rather do this in a consent agenda format. I provided the list more for reference purposes in case anyone wanted to see where headmaster had currently appears. Any thoughts or questions, Jennifer?
Yes, I'd like to make a motion. I'd like to make a motion to approve the change from headmaster to head of school in all of the listed documents. And I would like to personally thank you for going through the entire document and finding all of these instances. So thank you for doing that work. That was laborious. And I would also like to make a motion that we, I guess, approve it and recommend it to the full committee. Do we have to do that? Is that the appropriate motion?
Yes.
Okay.
I second the motion and the thank you.
All right. Okay, your vote, Jennifer?
Yes.
Valerie?
Yes.
Andy?
Yes.
And I also vote yes. All right. And Robin, a question for you. Just logistically, how do we go about actually changing all these policies? Do I go through and make those actual edits and then this gets posted on our website once the full school committee approves?
So
Okay.
I have the electronic version of the policy manual, so I can make those changes and I will post the corrected version online.
Okay, thank you. All right, our next,
David, I'm sorry to interrupt. I just have a question, a more technical question. You know, when we update and approve our policies, there's a new date listed as in last approved. Is that
Yes.
going to happen when we do this? Because we didn't really review and approve the entire policy and update it. It's just a name change. Can we just, I guess I actually in some ways prefer it not to be listed with a new date because it would appear as though we had approved and, you know, edited and revised the entire policy versus swapping out a name. How will that work?
well, sometimes what happens is there will be a specific notation of what the change was. So I think we do include a date, but we mentioned that it was just updating the name. Because looking through this list, there are certain policies that I'm not sure that we really need to have them anymore. There's one about the Pledge of Allegiance and that teachers are required to offer the pledge once a week. And that's obviously not happening anymore. I'm not sure that's even what state law requires anymore. And that policy is from 1970, but nevertheless, Headmaster appeared in there. So at least for now, I think we might as well change the Headmaster language everywhere and then maybe go through some of these policies later on when we are looking toward synthesizing what we have. Because as a general matter, and we've discussed this several times before, I think that our policy handbook could be much shorter. There are a lot of obsolete policies in here. There are other policies that perhaps we want to maintain but are way too long, are much longer than necessary. We could probably cut the policy handbook down by as much as 20%, maybe even more. But until we go about that on a policy by policy basis, I think we want to be consistent about changing the terminology, which we just voted to do. So I think we would include that notation under each one of these policies that we were only updating the change in terminology.
Okay, that, as long as we have some way of noting whether or not it's just a language update versus a policy review. Does that make sense? Just as whatever we do, as long as we have a way of keeping track of which policies we've actually gone through and updated. I agree, we have a lot of policies that need to be not only be updated, but I'm sure there are some that may be unnecessary at this point or incorporated into other policies. So I encourage us to continue that work.
All right. Okay, so next up, we have a discussion of the draft restraint policy. We received earlier today the new draft that has been edited by central office. It is a much shorter version than our initial draft. This one's 3 pages. The original one, I don't recall at the moment, but it was significantly longer. However, it had a lot of elements to it that we would normally think of as procedures. And the central office edited version seems to reference that at some subsequent time, procedures will be publicized or provided to staff. Dr. Guillory, would you like to speak to how this staff edited draft came to be?
Sure, thank you. I think you actually hit all the big salient points. So just for context, I think when I think about policy, I think about them as general guidelines for discretionary action. So the more that we have stipulated in a policy, I see it as the more restrictive it becomes for the district to take action or behave nimbly at those times. So for the broad sense, what we want to make sure is just that that the policies are reflected in the information that's reflected in the policy is broad enough in scope that each time, just to Jennifer's point that she just made, that each time there's a change in something, we don't have to come back to the policy to revamp it to bring it into compliance. So the broader that it can be, knowing that there are then procedures that follow that get into the specificity, I think is the way we looked at it. So in terms of just the introduction, you know, that piece is there. I don't know that much change happened there. I was looking for my original version of it. But we did change or add, unfolded some of the bullets there to add a few more there, as well as group some things together. And then the other part is looking at, looking at there were a number, I think, of definitions and those types of things that came directly out of the commissioner's regulations. So we sent those back to commissioner's regulations, just to say that those items we would refer to as appropriate there. And then I think the other point, again, is about some of these things were procedural in nature. So we pull those back out and have those certainly retained. But again, looking at the policy in the broadest sense possible that gives general direction for the superintendent and the district to take versus the nuance of the day-to-day, how to operate or how to institute it. So that's the broad context of how, and then it's also looking at sister district policies on this as well, I think, and looking at some of our peers, their policies, when we went and looked at those, can be printed and essentially are one-pagers. But at the same time, we want to recognize the direction that and the belief, the value system that Brookline also embodies. And so I think that's important to be in the policy piece here. Does that help give context, Dave?
Yes, thank you. Appreciate that. Do subcommittee members have any thoughts? Andy, go ahead.
Simply that we didn't receive this draft until earlier today, and so at least I have not had a chance to go through it and really compare it with the previous one. I mean, I certainly agree, Linus, with your overall, with the approach that you described, but there just hasn't been a chance to actually review it.
I agree with Andy. I also didn't have an opportunity to review it and feel it's a really important piece to go through meticulously.
Yes, and we don't have to vote on it today, but I think it's important that we continue the discussion at least. These two versions are quite different, but I do think most of it was basically leaving the procedures for a separate document so that the district can be more nimble about making certain changes without having to go through policy each time.
So I would ask that Casey be here to give some examples of what that means at the next meeting, because nimble to me in this context makes me very nervous. So I would just, unless you can do that, Dr. Guillory, I would love for Casey to be here to be able to provide us with some examples of what that might be.
Right.
In a real world context.
Yeah, and then certainly, the need to actually to review it and do the comparison also, that you need the time to do that as well.
I would also note that the initial draft was built off of what Cambridge has. So Cambridge was very procedure heavy, even in their policy. And I wonder whether that was intentional on their part, precisely for the reasons that Val is articulating about the importance of school committee and the general public being aware of what's taking place when it comes to the use of restraints for our students, and to make sure that very strong protections are built in rather than leaving that to backroom decision-making. Not that it would be inappropriate decision-making, but nonetheless, there is a level of transparency that can sometimes be lost when you don't really know the specifics of the protections that are being provided. So is yet another reason why I think it'll be useful for all of us to in detail compare the first draft to the second draft. And maybe that means going with the second draft, maybe that means something in between, but seeing what are the elements perhaps from the first draft that we think are really critically important to be included, and what could be left for a separate procedures document. Jennifer?
Also would be helpful, although I may be able to click through. I'm a print person, so I printed them out. I also did not have enough time. I got only partway through the first page before we had to meet, because I had a meeting prior to this right after work. So I wasn't able to have the time to really go through, but just in reading this document, there's a reference to 603 CMR, and I think there's a link in my live document. I'm not, Mass General Law references, I'm familiar with CMR. Maybe Val can tell me what that means. She often can tell me these things. She says
It's the regulation that's attached to the implementation of a law.
Is it, so it's on it's a state?
It's a state level,
Okay,
it's a
so
state level regulation.
So
It's-
it's
It stands
referenced a
for
lot.
Code of Massachusetts Regulations. Sorry, go
Tell me
ahead.
again, what is it?
It stands for Code of Massachusetts Regulations.
Okay, all right, that's very helpful to me, but I don't know what it is. So, and it's referenced like 8 times in the document. So I wonder if we should inform members of the public, or I always try to read it like in my parent, role and sort of say like, okay, does this make sense to me? If I didn't know what some of this stuff was because of school committee or my day job. So I think it might be helpful to just have a notation somewhere within it about how people can find it, or have a live link, make sure there's a live link in there to reference so people can click through, maybe a short notation about what it is, where even if no matter what version of the document we go through, I think that would be helpful. And I do think it sounds like a lot of people would like some time to compare the two drafts.
I also want to mention that at the meeting that preceded this, which was a gathering with our legislative leaders, both at the state level as well as the federal level, Congressman Auchincloss talked about some pending federal legislation that he is one of 99 co-sponsors on, called Keeping All Students Safe Act. That's currently at the House Education Subcommittee, and that's going to bear some relevance to what we do here, because of course anything done at the federal level we would need to be in compliance with. It also just sort of underlies the importance of this broader issue. This is not just something that we're dealing with in Brooklyn or at the state level, but it's also of great concern to the federal government. And all the more reason, I think, that we want to be very careful and very intentional about what we include in the policy, even if it includes a few procedural elements.
David, do you, it sounded like at the other meeting that you were familiar with that piece of legislation. Do you sort of give like a broad stroke kind of statement about the nature of that legislation or the goal of that legislation?
It seeks to ban seclusion completely as an option for restraining students. It also looks to make sure that we are not utilizing restraint as a punishment mechanism, as a disciplinary mechanism for dealing with students, but more for emergency type situations. It's very similar to what we're dealing with at the state level. But I would say that the protection is even more expansive, and it's also very procedurally heavy in that there are a lot of requirements around notification of parents and caregivers. There are a lot of specific requirements around training for those who would be utilizing restraint.
Thank you. That's helpful. Do you know if they are defining seclusion as even like, well, ideally it's all supervised. I'm pretty sure that's within the law now, but are they differentiating between like supervised seclusion and like a timeout space, or like when talking about banning seclusion completely, like some kids really need a space to decompress? Are they talking about banning that as well?
No, so timeout would still be allowed. The issue with seclusion is more if the child's in a completely enclosed area, so that would be prohibited, period. Secondly, the child needs to be supervised. So a timeout scenario where you have a child in one corner of the classroom, but it's still basically an open area, that would still be acceptable. And there are the other timeout situations where a child might be in the hallway or might be in an adjoining space. As long as there's another adult with that child, then that would be permissible.
What about if you're in a separate, an adult, maybe say an aide or another special education, whatever, another adult is supervising a child in a separate room with a door intended as like a timeout space? Is that seclusion? And that's considered, that would be under this potential law, federal legislation, not permissible?
if the adult is with the child, then that would be permissible. What the intent at both the state and the federal level is with banning seclusion is to say we're not essentially going to lock a child up in a room alone.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah. Okay.
Well, in the past, that has sometimes happened. I'm not saying
No.
here, but in general.
That's, yeah, no, I understand. I understand the need and the desire. I'm just was looking more specifically, just trying to see how that might play out. The
I
other
can
thing
certainly
that was
include-
noted. Oh, sorry, go ahead,
I was
David.
just going to say, I can certainly include a copy of that proposed legislation for our documents, and we can peruse that as well as we work through our own
Well,
policy.
and I was gonna say that, but he mentioned, I think that it's not even gone through markup at that level, right?
Right.
So we may be pretty far from whatever version they have now may not really guide us as closely as something we might get in the future. Anyways, thank you.
Any other thoughts? We have a member of the public watching. Ms. Clausen, would you like to participate? If so, please raise your virtual hand. All right, perhaps another time. So we'll definitely be discussing this at our next meeting, and we'll continue to work through it. So that'll bring us to our next agenda item, which is the discussion of the draft pesticides policy. Now, as you may recall, at our last meeting, we received feedback from Mr. Richmond indicating that we ought to word our policy more strongly and have it in concert with the resolution that we had passed unanimously at the subcommittee level and by a majority vote at the full committee, which was more detailed in terms of the particulars of what the pesticide ban would include. I do have an update from Matt Gillis around our current practices. He sent an email earlier today. I'm going to pull that up now. Just a moment. The email states, PSB has an IPM plan for indoors managed by the building department and outdoors managed by DPW. In short, we do not use 2,4-D in our current IPM plans. However, our plans do allow for the use of glyphosate to remove poison ivy. After a brief discussion with the operations manager for the Parks Department, they can try other products and see how effective they are or how effective they have become to comply with the new PSB policy. He appreciated some flexibility to use glyphosate if nothing else really works. DPW has been managing the grounds and outdoor IPM plans for some time and is aware of concerns some folks have with pesticides and has tried some other products over the years. So I'm wondering if subcommittee members have any thoughts on the new draft and whether these comments from Matt Gillis influence your thinking of the current draft language. While this ties back to an earlier discussion around how specific we want to be with prohibitions on narrow matters, I wonder whether, do we want to explicitly mention 2,4-D and glyphosate in our policy, or do we want to leave that out for a related procedure? Now, Mr. Richmond clearly believed that we should straight out include it so that the language of our policy matches the resolution where we endorse state legislation that would flat out ban these two particular types outside of an emergency situation.
What's the broader, I'm sorry, Jennifer. What's the broader group that those two fit in? And, you know, that's where, that's, in my mind, that's where you would say you don't support the use of these types rather than singling those two out specifically. Because then that gives you broader coverage. That's always my concern when we get overly specific in the policy, is it becomes too myopic rather than going up to the parent group that impacts all of them or a larger number. So that's just my thinking. I mean, I can't weigh in on the specifics of this one, and I was in the last meeting where we discussed that, but would rely on both the town folks and Matt's expertise on this.
So broadly, they're under the category of toxic pesticides, but these are the two that are explicitly mentioned by proposed state legislation due to the deleterious health impact that it's believed they may have on children. The current language of this draft policy states including glyphosate and 2,4-D. So it's not that it would only be those two, it would be pesticides in general, but those two are mentioned essentially as examples of what would be banned, except for emergency situations. Jennifer?
Just to clarify again, you said that Matt said we are not currently using 2,4-D, is that correct? But that we occasionally use, there's some times where glyphosate is being used. Is that
Yes.
correct? So I would support the language as is in being specific. Specifically because it says unless as a last resort in emergency situation. So I'd like to see us exhaust our other more organic, non-toxic, child-friendly, human-friendly, earth-friendly alternatives. But this language does allow us, for example, if we try some other things for poison ivy and it doesn't work, that we can go to these alternatives if we need to, because it becomes sort of a public nuisance. So I'm comfortable with the language as is. I think sometimes too, we just have to, it's hard for, change is hard. Using new products and new things is hard for all of us. And I think that in the interest of student health and safety, I would support this language.
All right, Valerie?
I agree with Jennifer, and we had a pretty extensive conversation about this when we had our related vote on this topic. And I feel strongly about standing by that vote for the safety of our students, those who play on our fields, and everyone else who's in the community.
Andy?
Yeah, I agree that without either a rigorous definition of toxic, which I don't think we have, or giving some specific examples, then it would be very hard to interpret the policy.
I also agree. And I think that we don't want to be in the practice of shaping our policies around what the district is currently doing. The purpose of policy, I think, is to be prospective and follow norms that we want to adhere to, not just look at what's the status quo and then codify a justification of the status quo. Now, sometimes the status quo is the correct approach, but not always. While I find current practice to be informative in terms of knowing what the implications might be, I don't think that they should rule out necessarily potential departures from what we do currently. And the way that this is phrased, it is not an absolute prohibition. If it turns out that the less toxic means do not work, we could still use these products. So would someone like to move this policy to the full committee? All right, thank you, Jennifer. Is there a second? Thank you, Valerie. Jennifer, your vote?
Yes.
Valerie?
Yes.
Andy?
Yes.
And I also vote yes. All right, next up is a discussion of a draft sustainability policy. Now, the first draft that you received was lifted from the Acton-Boxborough district, which has this as their sustainability policy since 2017. Most districts do not have a sustainability policy. This was one of the few that I could find. Stephen, who is going to be running a sustainability panel that's currently being put together along with students and various other community stakeholders, as well as district staff, worked on a draft as well, and that's been sent out, although it was only sent maybe a couple hours ago. So I'm not sure if members have had an opportunity to review it, but I'd like to turn the floor over to Stephen to talk about his draft and why this is so important for Brookline to undertake. Go ahead, Stephen.
Thanks, David. At first, I wouldn't say that I'm about to run a sustainability panel. I'm looking into the feasibility and viability of some coordinating mechanism that the school committee can participate in. I would just say that I thought the draft that you circulated initially was pretty good. I just would recommend a couple of changes. First, one is that we take this opportunity to take a more proactive stance on environmental education or vision of environmental education, wherein we're not just talking about the cultivation of virtues, but we're also empowering students to be active stewards of the earth. The second is that I added a clause on food services that overlaps somewhat with I think the one that you had on resource conservation. But I think it's worth calling out food services as a separate subcategory. And as for its importance, I think climate anxiety is very high among BHS students. Social studies teacher Roger Grandy did a survey of that I think 2 years ago. And so I'm looking to put some data together around this for a possible presentation to school committee on the 20th. But it's an issue of obvious importance to students and to youth in general. So I'm thrilled that this committee is already putting it together. I didn't realize it until you said so to me, David. Thank you.
You're welcome. Jennifer?
I did have a chance to review the document, so I have a couple of questions and some notes and things. So I'm really excited. I'm very supportive of a sustainability policy and the work Roger Grandy has done at the high school has done an amazing amount of work with students and with committees. And we have a number of collaborative committees already. And I wonder what, like, for example, Safe Routes to School is hugely involved in some of that, Steve, as well. And I like the inclusion of food services. And I think you went to a program, didn't you go to a program this summer? Was it Farm to School? I can't remember.
Yeah. And separately, that group is putting together a vision, or rather a mission, goals and activities around how Farm to School could function in Brookline as a standalone activity. I think that activity ideally would be a subset of this policy or would be aligned with this policy.
I think there's a lot of things going on through programs that are already happening and other groups, community groups, that it would be great to sort of like build on all of those outlets and make it more collaborative. So Steve, I commend you for trying to find a way to make that happen, because I think there's a lot of energy around this. And it's a matter of, figuring out how to channel that. And so a policy is a good place, sort of a structure for that. There were a couple of questions that I had. One, the education and engagement piece has significant impacts for OTL, for the Office of Teaching and Learning. And so I wanted to make sure we got feedback from from the district and some departments in the crafting of the language and sort of the scope of the policy. So that's just one note, David. That's sort of where, just especially from a curriculum perspective, getting some feedback from the Office of Teaching and Learning on the education and engagement piece. While I am hugely supportive of that, I think it would, be important to build partnership with the district in this particular area. The language of including through extracurricular organizations, clubs, and teams, which is part of that second paragraph. I just wanted us to think a little bit more about the funding for that. A lot of those activities are based on stipends, or they're not part of our school day. And I just don't know how much control we have. That's really a district question. I don't know how that operates or how much control we have over that piece. Unless we're saying as a school committee that we are going to go through some sort of funding and we are going to set aside funding to subsidize or to fund those particular items, and whether that, and thinking about that being equitable, because some schools have like a green team and some may not. And so I'm not sure that there's equity across schools, our K-8 schools. in that area. So I just want us to think a little bit about that. In the third paragraph, I like the food service piece. I wasn't really sure what it meant by the well-being of food chain workers. I mean, I understand what those words mean. More specifically, how would we do that as a district? How would we support that work? Like, what does that look like from a district perspective? Because that's something that's sort of out of our control. So I don't
I
know.
think that there are certifications that we would favor that promote just labor practices.
So I think we need to think about how we contain that. I'd love to hear some more. I need to think about that a little bit more, and I'd love to hear from some other members of the subcommittee about how we would incorporate that into what that looks like more specifically. Then there's a local resources section. Oh, sorry, I skipped high performance school buildings. I think maybe there's an edit that changes out high quality educational opportunities for an excellent education. And I just wanted to know, Steve, if that was your edit, what your thinking was about why that language was better, because I kind of liked the high quality educational opportunities. So was there like a specific reason you thought excellent education would be preferable in there?
Yeah, I thought educational opportunity was weaker than in education itself.
Well, I think I think that high quality educational opportunities could involve some of those things like after school and, well-being. I think it's actually broader and maybe more preferable. I don't know. So that's just some food for thought. That's a little bit of just wordsmithing, but under the local resources section, I was wondering if it was appropriate to fold that in with part of food services, because that's where a lot of that comes from. So just trying to think of there, it seemed like was sort of a duplication in some ways, unless there were areas where we thought perhaps it wasn't under food services and it was more like the toilet paper, paper towels, stuff like that was resources. I don't know if that is even something locally sourced, and I wasn't sure about the water piece either, but I don't know. So I wasn't sure if there was some way to incorporate local service resources into food services, or if there were specific areas we wanted to separate out from that. And then under resource conservation, give priority to environmentally preferable products. I just wasn't sure what that meant exactly. So maybe we could just clarify that language a little bit, because if as someone who considers himself to be an advocate for all of this, if I was unclear, I think other people might also be. So I think it's a one-page document, right? I didn't miss any off my printer. Okay, good. I just want to make sure I wasn't missing anything. Sorry, David, that was a lot, but those are my initial thoughts, and I'd love to see us, I think, clarified, and I'd love to hear from other committee members about their thoughts. And thank you, Stephen and David, for putting this together.
No, thank you, Jennifer. Andy?
Yeah, so I have a question about how we want to treat the buildings section. So that section talks about how we maintain our buildings, but it doesn't say anything about how we might design or construct our buildings. So is that a topic that we want to address elsewhere, or not address at all on a policy level? Or could it naturally go here, a sentence or two?
I feel like we've discussed it both here to a certain extent on the equity piece that we were talking about on our standards piece a meeting or two ago, and then also in capital. So I guess wherever we do it, I would want us to be consistent on how we're doing it.
And the capital discussion, was that about putting it in a policy? Or just practices that we intend to follow in the future?
I think it was practices for building materials.
Yeah.
Things like that.
And my question is more, it's less of what do we plan to do, but rather, do we want to embody it in a written policy, and is this the place for it? So.
Jennifer?
I'm not opposed to that. I'm not opposed to including it. I mean, our last several buildings have been very green, very proactive and being environmentally sound. I'm supportive of putting language in there. Part of that is based on what we can get funding for. Do you know what I mean? So like we could set a policy, but if town meeting doesn't want to support that, or whether it's the community through a vote, depending on, you know, exactly how the mechanics of it work out. I don't know how, I just don't understand how that would work. Like if we said we wanted it to be a policy, but we couldn't get the funding for it, then what happens then? I don't know. Do you know
Right.
what I mean, Andy? I don't know the mechanics of it. I'm supportive of putting language in. I think it's the inclination of the current committee, prior committees, and the community at large to want to do that. I just, I don't know how that works if we put it in and then we can't fund it.
Could be.
I'd be curious, I'd be curious on how that works with the MSBA project. So Driscoll's not an MSBA project, but Pierce will be. So I'm not sure how the state would line up with our policy.
The MSBA's approach is typically that it can choose not to fund what it considers an add-on, right? And if they consider this an add-on, they wouldn't forbid it. They just wouldn't contribute to that part of the cost.
I think a reasonable goal for this clause is to encourage the strong consideration of environmental effects of building projects, not to have a requirement for any particular practices that building or construction has to be aligned with, right? I mean, we could just, it could be a policy value that
I think what we can do,
require.
sorry.
Good,
I
sorry,
think
go
we can
ahead.
do, I think what we can do to address Andy's concern, which I share, about being clearer and consistent with our other policies, that this would also apply to construction and planning, is to flat out say so. So in this paragraph, it could be after an excellent education, through best practices in planning, construction, and management of high performance buildings, et cetera, and then the rest of it. Then it clearly encompasses all three: the planning phase, the construction phase, and then once they're already built, the management phase. And then to the earlier point raised by Jennifer about an excellent education versus high quality educational opportunities, I see both of your points. I think that the reason Stephen changed it to an excellent education is to be more proactive about it, to ensure that it will be embedded in our education period. Sometimes the word opportunity can sound softer there, saying there may be options for education in these areas, but we might not actually go through with them. So I would propose that we have both, and staff to support an excellent education and high quality educational opportunities. And that way, I think we cover everything in a more encompassing manner that way.
Yeah, I'm okay with either of them. It's fine. Ultimately, I think the idea is the same, but it's under the section of high performance school buildings. It's not even in the curriculum section. So I don't know, we maybe want to just think about where we put that.
Okay.
And I was just wanted to make sure when we talk about construction that we include not just new construction, but also renovations. Like anytime we're doing any sort of construction, whether that's small renovations or large renovations or new builds, rebuilds, just construction, any sort of work that we do or remediation.
I think construction would encompass renovation, but should we go ahead and add renovation to the list?
I mean, I think it does, but then again, I just want to make sure it's not open but there's not an opportunity for debate amongst that. So I don't know how clear we have to be.
All right, I think we could add the word renovation. So in that sentence, in planning, construction, renovation, and management of high performance, and then the rest of it.
That sounds good.
All right.
And I'm okay too, David, with just leaving it to, because it's a building issue, to say to support an excellent education. I don't think we have to make more words than need be, particularly in that section.
Okay. All right, any other thoughts? While this is creating potentially more work for another committee, to Jennifer's point about environmentally preferable products and practices and what that means, maybe we would want to include a line of saying that there will be a list of such products and practices provided by, and whatever the source might be. And that could be the Environmental Protection Agency, it could be a state agency, it could be a committee, but maybe providing some reference would address that concern.
what does it mean to be an environmentally preferable product? Are we saying, what does it mean to be environmentally preferable is actually the question that I guess that I had. Do we mean,
I think this goes back to our discussion previously on what does toxic mean and what does not toxic mean.
environmentally friendly products, it was that I didn't understand the language, environmentally preferable products. I don't know what that means to be environmentally preferable.
Suzanne, is Clint around? Can we ask him?
I mean, I think, yeah, anyway, so there's that question. Maybe I assume we're going to come back to this, David. I don't think we're
Yes.
clearly, right? We're not going to attempt to vote this, right? Today?
We don't have to vote it yet, so I'm of two minds on that. On the one hand, if we vote this today, it brings it for discussion for the full committee. On the other hand, I would like to give an opportunity for stakeholders to provide input. I'd also like to provide additional notice for our students who clearly care deeply about this to help formulate the policy. But then again, we heard their zeal at the last meeting and they really want something yesterday. So I'm a little hesitant to put it off too much longer, because if we put this off until our February meeting, then it's not coming before the full school committee until maybe March.
I know, but I don't want to rush it. I feel like I'm not prepared to vote it until, especially there's like curriculum stuff in here, until like we get district feedback, more district feedback. I think I'm not comfortable voting it. I'm also not comfortable holding it off for a long time either. I think we need more input.
Yeah, I agree with the OTL piece, but also getting some input from other stakeholders on lists of environmentally friendly products and, various lists and which one we decide to use or multiple lists we decide to draw from. And giving students and outside folks just an opportunity to really review it. I mean, I know that I haven't had an opportunity to really go into all of it myself.
I'll just say that I agree with that too. I think the critical thing is that this policy statement is the thing that we align all of our forthcoming activities with. So it's worth taking the time to get it right.
I wonder too, if this wouldn't be something I'm seeing, like, I'd love to get just some feedback or input from, I don't know, food services, maybe even OTL, operations, just to know that people have looked at it and provided input, some of our educators and students who are actively working on some of these issues. There may be things we haven't thought of that we want to include, maybe things that we're already doing. So I'm very interested in getting some more input, but I also don't want to wait a long time. Not that I don't want to wait, I don't want to put it off longer than it needs to be.
And also, Stephen, I wonder if at the next select board climate action committee meeting, this could be shared with everyone and we could get that committee's input.
That committee is being reorganized right now. They just proposed something to the select board where a small group is appointed directly by the select board. So that, I think that group's in limbo right now. But I think we can canvass some of the individual members for their expertise.
Have you talked to the sustainability director about this, Stephen?
Tom Barrasso, no, not yet.
All right, any other thoughts? Jennifer?
Well, she may already have it, but I'm just wondering if, like, Helen as chair of capital might have some input or feedback too, just because we're specifically talking about some building projects.
Okay. Then on the local resources section, this wouldn't necessarily be for policy, but something we could consider doing with our students and other town partners. We have an Allendale farm that I don't think we're currently utilizing very much, and that could potentially be an exciting opportunity for the community to utilize them when we're talking about local resources and perhaps consider some programmatic opportunities with a farm that's right here in Brooklyn. All right, any final thoughts on this? And we'll pick it up again at the February meeting. Okay, seeing none, let's turn to new business. Is there any new business? All right, doesn't look like there's any. So in that case, that concludes today's policy meeting. Andy and Val, you're getting about a half-hour break before negotiation, so hope you enjoy it. All right, good
Thanks,
night, everyone.
everybody. Have a good night.